everyone, and welcome to a Fireside chat from MEF. And this time, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Chris Drake, the CTO of iconectiv. Hello, Chris.
Good afternoon, Dario.
Hi there. Thanks again for coming here today. You are in New Jersey, and I'm now based in Europe and Italy. We meet somewhere halfway through, but thanks for being so ready for a chat on a very important market for us and for the world, the USA. We'd like to know a bit more about what's happening in telecom, some of the things behind the scene, I would say. But first of all, Chris, a few words about yourself, if I could ask you. Tell us more about who's Chris Drake. I mean, this famous CTO, but who's behind the iconectiv brand?
Yes, thank you for asking that. Well, I've been in telecom for more decades than I'm going to actually quantify here. I started out in Bell Northern Research in Canada and made my way to the States, where I've been since 2001, in fact. So more time here than my early Canadian career. I am a fraud enthusiast, I think I'll say. Those are fair words to use. I'm fascinated by the fraudsters and their ingenuity and the speed at which they innovate. And I am always watching the new tricks of the trade that they perpetrate. We'll be talking about quite a few of those things because the American market is so fertile for fraud that we get to see every type of exploit there is. So we'll talk more about that.
Oh, fantastic. So thanks. So we have plenty to talk about and plenty to talk about fraud and how the telecom system is set up to fight fraud in the USA. So that's a very good start. Well, maybe let me try a dangerous game here. I'll introduce iconectiv, so you can tell me if I understand what you do or not. But the reason for iconectiv to be here is because you have a name sometimes not seen by the general public. But the big, well, I don't know if policeman would be a word, but a traffic controller, flow control of information within the different device systems and so on. And that's where fraud sometimes get detected, avoided, etc. I hope that's close enough, but I suspect there is not the real story. Tell us a bit more about iconectiv, Chris. What is it?
Well, so that wasn't bad at all. However, there's a lot more to it simply because iconectiv's been around since the beginning of the Bell system and spun out in 1984 as shared software systems with the breakup of the Ma Bell. And we eventually became Bell Core and then Telcordia, and now we've been iconectiv for the last 6 years, 5 to 6 years. So we've been around a long time, and we've been involved in the evolution of the telecommunications networks. And as you said rightly, for us, it's all about information. And we provide information as a service. So it's deep down in we could say the bowels, if that's not a bad word, of telecom, in the plumbing. What information would help connect people and their devices to businesses and each other at any time, simply, seamlessly, and securely. And what threats exist in a world where it is so simple and so ubiquitous to connect with each other. That grabs the attention of the fraudster. So what kind of information services can we provide that help inform people doing communications that there could be risk, that they should be more attentive to potential fraud and to mitigate and block such fraud. So we have a variety of offers that simply help with the seamless and secure interconnection at scale, and we have a bunch of offers that relate to fraud mitigation, which is unfortunately, as we'll talk about around the US market, is a fact of life. The easier you make things to do, the more the fraudsters will show up.
So true. So, well, you mentioned it, risk information. So let's talk about the USA. And what would you say, from a specific point of view, that currently are the biggest threats affecting the USA markets? What's happening out there?
Yeah, so that is an interesting thing to try to rank, order, or quantify, because the U.S. holds the unenviable position of being the most attractive market for fraudsters, and the reasons are multifold for that. A convergence of such a large population, that is digitized with mobile phones and internet access, relatively high value of our subscribers in terms of a transfer of wealth between them and the fraudster, and the very easy, convenient way you can make payments in America, even many of them untraceable, such as Amazon gift cards or credit card purchases made to impersonators, so that the fraudster cannot be tracked and prosecuted. So we have that whole phenomenon going on here, and we see that payment mechanism being so convenient and often untraceable leads to a family or category of frauds you don't see as often in other parts of the world.
And what would you say that is the cost of this fraud to the telecom companies themselves?
Well, the last study that we have is a year old, but it quantified the cost of fraud at $30 billion annually, which is a frightening statistic, and growing, by the way. It's growing in the sense that certain frauds are six-fold in size from where they were back maybe 5 years ago. So it's just growing exponentially. Maybe I could talk about the categories of fraud just to kind of ground this in a terminology that would help the audience. So there are basically 4 categories of fraud. I would say you could argue there may be 6 or 7, but you know, at the high level, there's probably 4 key categories. One is international revenue share fraud, which we call IRSF, and I'll use that term for simplicity for the rest of this discussion. This is the most common fraud, and it takes many, many forms. Fundamentally, this is a fraud where making calls to premium numbers generates charges backwards, eventually to the serving carrier of the calling party subscriber, but there is no one there to pay that bill, and then the telecom company gets stuck with it. Right? Now, this happens in many, many ways. There are malware attacks where if you download a virus, it will make calls to these premium numbers while you're asleep and rack up huge charges that you don't even know are happening. Or they may be hacking a PBX, an enterprise call server, which we call a private branch exchange. And that generates calls also in off hours to these premium numbers and racks up a huge bill that then the enterprise refuses to pay and says, I never made those calls. Ultimately, if they want to keep their customer, the telecom provider ends up footing this bill. Then you have the Wangiri attack. This is more common in all over the world than, say, the malware might be. In a Wangiri attack, the fraudster rings you once and displays a caller ID that happens to be a premium number. And the curious amongst us will call back. Now, we have seen cases where you would have millions and millions of calls to subscribers, and all they need is a yield. We have a case of a 4% yield on the people that call back and generate premium charges, and then of course would refuse to pay, saying, oh, I was tricked, I didn't mean to do that, and foot the carrier with the liability. But 4% yield, if you can make millions and millions of these calls, is a great way to make $10 million in an afternoon. So why not? And that's one of the major, what we call attack vectors for the exploit known as IRSF. The exploit being how did they make money? The attack vector meaning how did they get the situation to happen where they could make that money? And then lastly, we have street crime, which is the only case of a, say, near in proximity fraud where they actually have to get the phone off the person. And once they have that, they make all kinds of premium international calls. And again, no one is willing to pay that bill, and the originating carrier is stuck with it. So that is a significant category of fraud that often is blended with other frauds. The second one, in terms of highest rank, is subscription fraud. This is where a subscriber falsifies their application for telecom services, and for some period of time, racks up huge charges and is no longer there to pay. Now, they may be basically establishing a SIM farm and reselling telecom services. So they basically take a computer-based call and re-originate locally on that SIM that they got through the telecom service. And they do this in the thousands. So they do this at scale, and they drive around in trucks so you can't isolate them to a particular cell site or cell sector. And they just keep evading and popping up under a new persona and leave the carrier stuck with the bill at the end. Oftentimes they're making IRSF calls. So instead of reselling telecom services, they're actually making absolutely fraudulent calls that are at premium charges, and they're not going to be there to pay the bill. So you can see how that bleeds over into the first category. Identity theft then is also very popular in the US. The most common examples of that are the IRS, the taxation fraud, and the Social Security fraud, where a caller ID and name is presented as that agency, but it is not in fact them, it's an impersonator, and they trick the colored party into divulging information, providing even much richer personal information once the dialogue unfolds, and they use that to create an identity theft package, which they can sell on the dark web for, $50, $80, depending on, say, the net worth of the individual. Also, there are fraudulent charges, which I'd call the last major category of fraud in America, is when a robocaller impersonates a real brand such as Marriott Hotel Resorts and says you've won a trip to the Marriott Resort as their lead-in, and eventually it's not the Marriott Resort at all. They may take a processing fee or a reservation fee that's very cheap, $100 for 4 nights. Sounds very compelling. It's not actually Marriott, and it might not be anything at all. So these fraudulent charges are quite commonplace in terms of you've won a sweepstakes, there's a processing fee to get your money, or you've inherited something. We all know that scam from Ethiopia or Somalia or somewhere, Nigeria, and you must pay a handling fee to get that inheritance money. And there's an amazing number of people who fall for this scam, even as well popularized as they are. So those are kind of the 4 major categories of fraud the US is afflicted with, and something that we're working hard to mitigate when that fraud is perpetrated through abuse of the telecom system.
4 major categories of fraud, and they all seem to be quite common and scary. Now, Chris, give us some good news. Is something happening as well in the world? Is it getting better at any point?
Getting better. I will tell you honestly, it's getting worse before it gets better. In 2017, we had 2 to 2.5 billion robocalls a month in America. And now we have over 5 billion robocalls a month in America. In fact, every second of the day, 1,500 or more robocalls hit a US subscriber. 1,500. Another frightening statistic to show the scale at which these perpetrators are executing their plans and their campaigns for ill-gotten gain. The US has stepped up because of the exponential growth in the robocalls, of which as of May, they estimated almost 40% of those robocalls, the illegal ones, were scams, actually scams trying to either steal your identity or take some money from you. And they estimate by the end of this year, there'll be 50% of those 1,500 calls per second will be scams. Not just nuisance spam calls, but scams. So that's a frightening statistic. So there's just a lot of frightening statistics. Now the US Congress and the regulator, the FCC, have stepped up to push back against the robocallers and deploy solutions. And they have allowed for a voluntary scheme by the US carriers and their related telecom associations to deploy something called Stir Shaken, or Shake and Stir. And that is an interesting technology that I believe will be quite helpful in stemming the tide and starting to drive those 5 billion calls down.
Can you explain a bit more about Stir Shaken? And if I'll do it, I'll make some silly jokes about James Bond knowledge.
Yeah.
So tell us more. What is it?
Well, Stir Shaken is fundamentally a better way to authenticate the caller ID as calls move between networks. The Shaken stands for signature-based handling of asserted information using tokens. So now we can say the joke. Engineers in the standards group spend a lot of time thinking up tortured acronyms that they think they can create a theme on. So there is a James Bond theme here, of course, with STIR, which stands for Secure Telephony Identity Revisited, or Secure Telephone Identity Revisited. And that was done first, and the shaken was a counter response to STIR, of course. Shaken, not stirred, the James Bond's saying. But what it is a technology based on voice over IP. So basically, we're taking technology that created the problem and we're using it now to solve the problem. So that's quite ironic and somewhat satisfying. The onslaught of illegal robocalls at the scale we see it today is based on the confluence of a few factors. Voice over IP, incredibly cheap to initiate calls at volume. Also, you can fundamentally declare whatever caller ID you want on those calls and have that presented to the caller party, at least in today's networks. And lastly, you can do that and move around and avoid detection, right? So voice over IP is the great enabler of robocallers and scammers. But it's also going to be the basis for cryptographically assuring the authenticity of caller ID between networks.
Once again, what's the shaken? Why do we need shaken in these parts?
Why do we need shaken? That's a great question. Well, I'll start with a little bit more about what is STIR. STIR is a working group within the Internet Engineering Task Force. This is the standards body that created the SIP, the Session IP protocols. And they have now built extensions on top of SIP with new headers for digital signatures that convey authenticity in terms of a caller ID, who they're calling, and at what time they call them. And that is a set of protocols that Shaken has adopted with certain additions to ensure there's governance and a trust model behind it. So fundamentally, anybody could initiate a call and sign it with the STIR protocol. Why should you trust that? Why is that any better than where we are now? It isn't better, unless you can be certain that the signature is from a bona fide telecom provider or other upstream party that is trusted, and that when you verify this authenticity, when you serve the call it party in the terminating network, that's part of this trusted group that's allowed to sign calls. So we basically have Shaken designed to keep the imposters out of the system, which is really important. And STIR in its own right by itself doesn't actually control any of that mischief.
So why would the MEF members be interested now in this technology? What can we do with it?
Well, so I think it's really interesting that the US Congress passed an act last year that added text messaging to the Truth in Caller ID Act that we have in the United States, meaning that not only now can you not spoof caller ID for voice calls in the case where it's meant to incur harm or cause mischief, you also cannot do this for text messages anymore. And the FCC has taken steps to ensure that text messaging has the same cryptographic certainty about the caller ID when it crosses networks and ends up at a terminating consumer party as for voice. So the MEF ecosystem is full of content providers, application providers, businesses who wish to engage consumers in a rich experience, conversational commerce, as we call it, coming down the pipe with RCS, and the carriers who carry and deliver that message to that consumer. This whole value chain is exposed to potential fraud where imposters can insert themselves and piggyback on a brand's legitimate messages and therefore seem to be equally legitimate and then trick the consumer into things like Wangiri. We see Wangiri coming from sender addresses exactly the same as caller ID presented on voice that tricks the user into calling back. This is important, call me back right away, right? And it's a premium sender address. So if they call back, they're hit with those fees. It's just IRSF in SMS clothing. So these sorts of things are happening. And the malware, right? Sending close but not quite URL. I, in fact, got an SMS this year from michaelcore.com. Now, if you were my daughters, you would know it's Michael Core's dad. There's an S in there. You shouldn't have fell for that. Well, I knew that because I take them shopping a lot. But other people might not see the missing S and might click on that link and end up infected. And then we end up with the same automatic calls at night or a ransomware attack where they must pay money to get their phone back. And so SMS and its evolution to RCS are just as vulnerable to the same kinds of mischief as voice, and in just slightly different forms, but the attacks are comparable. And the MEF ecosystem, is already working hard to ensure a good customer experience and value for the brands engaging in it, right? We need to overlay that with additional controls beyond what you're already doing in terms of mitigating the imposters from fundamentally spoofing whatever they wish to a wide range of consumers on mobile phones.
Well, perfect. So is there shaking now being applied to other countries? Is there momentum building?
Yeah, I would say there's momentum, but when you look closely at it, the U.S. will be the very first to deploy STIR/SHAKEN, and it will do so in the fourth quarter of this year, ideally and almost certainly before Thanksgiving in late November. And Canada is very close behind. They have regulation requiring the deployment of technology for cryptographic authenticity of a caller ID for the purpose of mitigating robocalls and spoofing. And so they're a bit behind on their deployment, but they are watching the US closely and likely to take a very similar track as the US STIR/SHAKEN one. The UK has been following this for over 2 years and has given a mandate to their interconnect forum, the NIC, to study the application of this to the UK market. And we know from other studies that these kinds of frauds, not all of these frauds, but frauds like Wangiri, for example, are very prevalent in both texting and voice in many, many countries around the world. And in fact, I was at a regulator in the Middle East a few months ago, and we were talking about SHAKEN, and I was truly surprised how much they knew about it, how familiar and how much research they had done. So this has eyes all over the world on the US first deployment of STIR/SHAKEN, and we're certainly looking forward to help the rest of the world adopt it in due course.
So Chris, I think we'll have to come back to you time and time again to check the status and the deployment of that. So meanwhile, can I ask you something, not just about STIR/SHAKEN, but on iconectiv roles in STIR/SHAKEN and a few other things. You're also working in local number portability as an administration for the USA. Well, can you give us a bit more of a positioning of what you do and how it works, so to speak?
Right, very good question. So fundamentally, iconectiv works with entire industries on a national level to solve complex problems where there's an ecosystem of operators and interested parties like businesses, aggregators, application providers, all trying to help the subscriber and businesses connect with each other in a simple, seamless, and secure way. So with number portability, we are the world's leader in that, with the most countries deployed, and of course our focus is on the larger countries. So in terms of subscriber coverage, we're well ahead of the next biggest competitor in number portability. When you do that in a country, you have to sit down with the regulator and a consortium of the operators and draft a set of procedures that everyone feels is implementable and has high integrity in terms of, well, when can you ask for a port as the new operator, and when can you refuse to give up this number, which is something all operators would like to do, but there needs to be a valid reason, and that reason needs to be managed and traceable. And after all that's done, everyone else needs to be able to route calls to that subscriber who's now on a different network than their natural phone number would suggest. So now you have to manage a distribution of port-corrected data or information as a service to a variety of providers on the national level, so that they can get say the MEF members can get that text message or a voice call, you can get that voice call to the right network, now serving the subscriber who has moved. So that kind of industry collaboration and joint development of a system, a framework, is very similar with Stir and Shaken. We have been appointed to be the Shaken policy administrator, or what is basically called the trust anchor in Shaken. We ensure a triangle of trust where a certificate authority is able to be defined as legitimately a provider of that certificate for originating carriers to sign calls, and we define that list also for the terminating provider that better be from such a certificate authority if you're going to trust what you see. And by creating this triangle between the certificate authority and the calling carrier and the terminating carrier, we ensure no imposter can break into the system and sign their own calls. That's a key requirement for Stir Shaken. Well, that's fundamentally why Shaken exists on top of Stir. So in order to do something like that, you have to devise a system of procedures and a framework of criteria to ensure there is that integrity and no one can break into the system. And if they did, how do you revoke their certificate credential so they can't sign any more calls?
I think our members of MEF would be very interested from some of your words about something else you're involved with, the shortcode registry in the USA.
Yes.
Can you explain how that works, and once again, what iconectiv does in there?
Right. Well, the shortcode registry is basically a 5 or 6 digit sender address for text messaging that is accompanied by a governance model that ensures a clean system, very good hygiene, no spam, no spoofing. And that is done by overlaying on top of the SMS standards some governance and administrative capabilities that ensure traffic between an application provider or aggregator and the terminating network are bound point to point, so that nobody can just piggyback on that and impersonate the real user of the shortcode, say United Airlines or Walgreens Pharmacy or a bank, even more so. That registry we administer, where we dole out unique 5 and 6 digit sender addresses to brands or other enterprises who want to engage in a clean, secure 2-way communication over SMS with their subscribers. They may be using these codes for one-time passcodes for logging into systems as a second factor authentication. They may be sending reminders or a notice of a flight gate change or a flight time change, or they may be sending coupons for marketing promotions. We won the shortcode registry and stood that up in 2016. That was important for us to show we're running a association-led, this is the CTIA in this case, scheme, a numbering system to allocate to the ecosystem on a national level, because we wanted to also parlay that into credentials to get the LNPA in the US, which was our most recent number portability administration system. That is the world's largest system by far, the most complex system, and the transition from the incumbent was a huge endeavor that required the whole national carrier footprint to collaborate, and it went off perfectly, which is very unusual for an IT transition. We're very pleased, even pleasantly pleased, how perfectly it happened, and that's a great credential for iconectiv and proof point that we can work with an entire industry on a national level and affect this kind of a system that will work quite well, like Stir and Shaken and other aspects of the robocalling and spoofing program.
Well, I have one more question for you then, because you're talking about the essence of MEF, making an impact in the ecosystem by bringing people together. So I'm taking notes now. How do you do it? What have you learned, and what are the key elements to bring people to a table and to draw up some of these overall rules and engagements for them?
Yeah, well, it's not easy, as you know already, as MEF acts in that capacity and tries to have that impact on national levels and regional levels, if not global. It's fundamentally about a deep knowledge of the domain. In other words, the devil is in the details. If you wish to get a group to agree on things, then you have to have it right. But secondly, facilitation is a key skill. You're trying to bring parties who are natural competitors to the same table, who don't really want to port a number, or who want to sign calls that maybe they shouldn't be signing because they don't have the same level of authenticity as another call. But hey, my customer wants my call signed. I'm going to sign that call, right? And so you get these competing interests at the table, and you have the regulator who just wants to protect the consumer, isn't terribly interested in the technology, but it's all important, right? So we have to facilitate that conversation, build on a common ground that we all want to protect the consumer. That's where we would start. Or we all want to honor the consumer's right to port their number, which is a matter of law for the most part. So we have to agree on some baseline objectives of what we're trying to do. And then we layer on components, breaking the system down into its stakeholders and its different architectural parts, and then drilling into each of those in turn and getting agreements that these are the way these things will work, and that they'll collaborate with each other on an end-to-end basis. And that's where the technical depth and understanding of the devil in the details comes into play. And we've been very successful at that in over 20 countries for number portability. We actually are working on the cross-border ability to sign calls with Shaken, so that a call from the UK or Canada into the US can be signed and known as authentic, and vice versa. And we're working that through the standards bodies today and discussing that with various regulators as well. So we look forward to not only helping on a national level countries deploy technologies like StirShaken, but also the cross-border capability, because a lot of the world is such a smaller place now. You can make these calls and send these messages from anywhere, and then terminate on the subscribers at a national level that need protection.
Great. Well, Chris, we started by mentioning some of the threats and some of the tools that fraudsters have got right now, but we end up on a lighter note almost on some of this collaboration, some of the things that are working out there, and to get the ecosystem is clean and fighting back where things are happening there and they shouldn't be. That's been a very good introduction, and I just call it an introduction because I can feel that there's much more happening between the lines here, but definitely very good. I'll ask you now, have you got any questions that you would like to be answered instead? Would you like to ask a question to any of our members? Or
I would absolutely like to, and I followed the work of the MEF and the best practices in terms of business to consumer or A2P messaging, the evolution to RCS, and code of conducts that govern both SMS and RCS. I'm a big fan of the work you're doing to establish guidelines and a code of conduct that people will adhere to ensure a clean system and value for the business and value for the consumer who's engaging, right? So my big question is, because you've been working on RCS and the best practices in RCS, including the importance of a verified sender, which is comparable to a certified caller ID and voice. What is your prediction on when businesses will jump onto RCS as an A2P channel and be doing verified sender to consumers, and which countries would you say will go first?
If that's a question for me personally, you know that I can use the first MEF amendments that says I will answer nothing, but our members will. And in that case, I can just refer back to some of the things we've heard from our consultant and forecasting, Mobile Square, to mention one of them, expecting a very big, important year for 2020 for RCS in terms of building the fundamentals. And actually, a quote for some of our members as part of Visa MEF itself, in terms of the fundamentals, will be the penetration of the users and the networks participating in the RCS story, but also some of the tools, including sender ID, as you mentioned. And as you know, we will be working closely with iconectiv and other members in the industry to make sure that that part is fully understood by all different members of the value chain within the messaging. And as you say, this shouldn't be just an RCS issue. It's a wider issue of how do we secure the identity of businesses and eventually identity of users as well. So once again, I think we have some more conversation to have with Chris and with iconectiv. So I'm looking forward hosting you or having the pleasure of discussing somehow with our members in different ways. So great. And I hope that this is just the beginning of many more conversation, Chris. But thank you again for joining us today on this quick informal chat, and have a good day from your side. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dario. We see MEF as an important vehicle for iconectiv to engage a broad ecosystem of players and stakeholders, and we thank you for the opportunity to talk to your membership about this today.
Great. Thank you again, and thank you all for joining us in this chat again. As you know, you will find more information on our website, and do send us questions through our usual emails, including mine, dario@mobileecosystemforum.com, as you can see on the screen as well. Thank you very much, and thanks, Chris, again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.